Let's call the case of the United States v. Kara Bassett. My name is Judge Melissa Watt. Scoring judges, please take this opportunity to look at the two buttons on the lower left of your screen and turn off your audio and video. These should remain off until the trial ends. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants. This means that the only people on the screen right now should be the advocates and me. Can the attorneys please make their appearances?
Yes, Your Honor. Hello, my name is Richard Madden, and this is my second chair, Ms. Gina Piriano. Together, we represent the people of the United States in the case of people of the United States versus Ms. Kara Bassett.
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Sonali Mehta, and I'm joined by my co-counsel, Mr. Seva Castleberry.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Mr. Castleberry will be assisting me with the technical elements of today's trial as we represent the defendant, Ms. Kara Bassett.
Okay, do we have any matters to attend to before opening statements?
Yes, Your Honor. I would like to point your attention to a few documents that you already have. One of them is the pretrial order, specifically numbers 7 and 10. Number 7 of the pretrial order states that all documents, exhibits 4 through 33, are already entered for today's case and may be used at any time during trial. Number 10 states that all searches, seizures, and things conducted by police officers during the course of their investigation were lawful, and all objections under amendments have been waived for today. And finally, Your Honor, on stipulation number 1, it states that the victim of today's case, Mr. Don Clark, was declared deceased on August 18th, 2018.
Okay, any objections from the defense on those?
No objections, Your Honor. Just in combination with that first stipulation Mr. Madden just read, I would like to draw your attention to the next, the next stipulation, number 12 on that pretrial order. It just states that under the laws, upon request from next of kin, a missing person can be declared deceased 1 year after they are last seen.
That's our understanding as well, Your Honor.
All right, anything else?
Nothing further from the prosecution.
Defense?
Yes, Your Honor. One matter regarding the technology in today's trial, we would just like to ask if for any reason you can't hear or see us as we're presenting, just to cut in and let us know. We did have some issues with internet connectivity earlier, but hopefully it should be okay.
That's good.
Your Honor, we would also like to invoke Rule 615, calling for the sequestration of witnesses, barring party representatives. Ms. Bassett will be in court throughout today's trial, although she isn't on screen with me.
Any objection to 615?
No objection, Your Honor, under Rule 615. It's our understanding that Ms. Bassett will be present, and we will not have a party representative.
Understood. Anything else?
Your Honor, I did just see a note from one of the jurors that they're not getting any audio. I don't know if we want to stop to figure that out.
I see that. Okay, I'm just checking to see if we can get the dial-in phone number. Okay, it's being worked out, I'm told.
Hi, Justin.
Hey, Bill, how you doing?
Doing pretty good, but the audio went off the moment I went into the breakout room.
Yeah, and so I apologize for that. We'll see if we can figure this out. We did have to start the trial because of the tournament schedule being tight. So I apologize that we couldn't get you an alternate way of hearing the trial. But if you're available,
All right. I think we're ready to proceed with opening statements. Everyone should make sure they are in speaker view now. That button is up on the upper right hand of your screen. Attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking. Prosecution.
May it please the court. Your Honor, members of the jury. This is a case about passion and poison. This is Kara Bassett. She's a lifelong animal lover, and she spent her entire life's work working with the animals that she loves the most, the elephants. You'll learn today that in Kara's mind, zoos were for people, were for profit. She believed in sanctuaries that were for the animals. It was Kara's dream to run and operate a sanctuary of her own where these elements could run free from all human intervention. And you'll learn that in August 2017, she granted that wish for herself. Now, members of the jury, this is Don Clark. Now, while Don and Kara were married, Don didn't see elephants the same way Kara did. He saw them for the exploitation, the business, the money that they made him. You see, these animals had made Don $8 million before he even turned 40 years old. You see, now Don and Kara disagreed on how to run this business, how to run this zoo. And we're here today not to prosecute Don for the way that he treated these animals, even if you disagree with that. We're here today to prosecute the defendant, Kara Bassett, for taking the law and ultimately her husband's life into her own hands in August of 2017. When Kara decided that she was going to do what she told us she was going to do over and over and over again. She decided to get rid of any obstacles to her sanctuary, taking them to the grave if she needed to. But members of the jury, we can't just tell you why Kara did it. We can't just tell you how she murdered her husband. As the prosecution today, we have the burden to prove that to you today. We have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Kara Bassett, is guilty of murdering her husband, Don Clark. And we expect to meet that burden for you today. And we can simplify just how we're going to do that. We have to prove that, one, Kara murdered her husband, and that, two, she did so knowingly and intentionally. And members of the jury, it will be abundantly clear that we've met those two prongs for you today. We're going to call the lead investigator, a person who over a course of a year gathered all of the evidence and spoke to every eyewitness they could in order to get to the bottom of what started as just a simple missing persons case and quickly evolved into the murder of Don Clark. Members of the jury, we're going to ask you to pay attention to three key pieces of evidence throughout today's trial: a van, a missing syringe, and a power of attorney form. Let's walk through how each of those things is going to appear during today's course. We expect you to hear about a van that was taken the same night that Don disappeared, took over a 100-mile journey away from where he lived but suddenly ended up only 5 miles from their residence. We expect the detective to tell you about this suspicious route and the evidence that he collected from that van that only pointed to Kara Bassett, Don's wife. That second piece of evidence, a missing syringe. We expect you to hear about a deadly concoction contained in syringes used to sedate elephants at the sanctuary. About how every single use of these syringes is carefully documented and put on a list. But the only time one of these syringes has gone missing and is unaccounted for, Don ends up missing and is presumed dead. Members of the jury, we're going to ask you to follow the path of that syringe and ask yourselves just who had access to that deadly sedation method. Kara Bassett. But also, members of the jury, we're going to ask you to look at a document that will be presented before you, a power of attorney form, one that granted Kara access to all of Don's funding, all of his investments, all of his money. We expect it to be clear to you, members of the jury, that Kara Bassett had millions upon millions of reasons to do what she did, because her husband, Don, was worth millions and millions of dollars. You'll learn that just months after Don was declared missing, Kara remade that zoo into the very sanctuary that she'd always wanted, showing you that she only ever needed that money from Don. Members of the jury, it would be clear to you the passion of Kara for these elephants led to the poisoning of her husband, Don. We expect the detective's testimony to make it abundantly clear how all the evidence only points to one person and one person only, Don's wife, the defendant, Kara Bassett. We're going to ask you to find her guilty of murder. Thank you.
Defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Unanswered questions. Mr. Madden just came up here and he told you that Kara Bassett and Don Clark were a married couple. That's true. He told you that Mr. Clark went missing in 2018. That's true too. But he told you that Mr. Clark went missing because of his wife, that Miss Bassett murdered her own husband. Members of the jury, that's not true. See, I want to walk you through the story of this case from Miss Bassett's perspective. You'll learn that, according to Miss Bassett, Don Clark was the love of her life. And sure, they argued about business decisions, but they made it work. You'll see that on the morning of August 19th, 2017, Miss Bassett woke up to find that her husband was missing. At first, she didn't worry. She thought he was on a trip. But as time passed, she realized something had to be wrong. So she called the police, hoping they would help her find answers. Instead, they accused her of murdering her own husband. See, members of the jury, the government is accusing Miss Bassett of murder. That means that it's their burden to prove to you, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Miss Bassett intentionally killed her own husband. They just won't be able to meet that burden today because the truth is, this is a case with too many unanswered questions. Now, over the course of today's trial, I want you to keep some of those questions in mind. First, where is the body? See, members of the jury, Mr. Madden just told you they believe Miss Bassett drove her husband's body and left it in a swamp. But you'll hear today, the FBI searched that swamp. They looked for that body, and members of the jury, they were never able to find it. Because of that, you won't see an autopsy report today, proving how or when or why Mr. Clark died. That's because the government just never found the victim's body. Second, what does their evidence actually prove? See, what you'll hear from the government today is a very specific story. They believe that Miss Bassett injected her husband with an elephant tranquilizer, a powerful chemical, that she drove his van hundreds of miles away to a swamp and then left it at an airport. Members of the jury, what you won't hear is any real evidence supporting that story. You're not going to see any DNA evidence or fingerprints proving that Miss Bassett was at the airport or at the swamp. You won't see any witnesses or any forensic evidence proving that Miss Bassett even left her home on the night in question. So finally, who else could have done this? Today, you're going to hear that not all of Mr. Clark's business dealings were entirely legitimate. You'll learn that Mr. Clark spoke with his attorney about purchasing property in Costa Rica using cash that was off the books. You're going to hear about a conversation that Mr. Clark had just hours before he went missing with someone with an unidentified Costa Rican phone number. Today, you're going to hear from someone named Mr. Joe Kwong, who was with Mr. Clark when he received those text messages. And I want you to pay attention as Mr. Kwong describes how Mr. Clark reacted, how the color drained from his face, how he seemed terrified, how he said, "I have to go deal with this," and then left. Members of the jury, the government won't be able to tell you today who was on the other end of that phone call. See, over the course of today's trial, the government is going to try to get you to forget those questions. They're going to tell you that Miss Bennett is a murderer. And members of the jury, I want you to keep in mind, underneath all those accusations is a human being, a grieving widow named Cara Bassett, a woman who woke up one morning to find that her husband was gone and was never coming back, a person who turned to the police for help. Members of the jury, it's your responsibility to presume that that woman is innocent. It's your responsibility to question the state's accusations, and at the end of this trial, when the state isn't able to answer your questions, well, it'll be your responsibility to find Miss Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you. Before the state calls its first witness, I'll ask everyone to switch to gallery view, and that button is up in your right hand of your screen. This will allow you to see the attorneys and the witnesses at the same time. Please proceed with your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, we call Investigator Steve Johnson to the stand. May we proceed?
Please.
Can you please introduce yourself?
Of course. Good morning. My name is Steve Johnson.
What do you do for a living, sir?
I'm currently a senior special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigations.
How long have you been doing that?
Well, I started off with the FBI back in 2002. At that point, I was a new agent trainee. A year later, I became a special agent, and then in 2012, I became a senior special agent. So I've been in that role for about 8 years.
About how many cases do you think you've worked on regarding topics of this nature?
Well, in 2007, I became a part of the Criminal Investigations Division. And in that role, I investigate violent crimes, things like homicides, kidnappings, and aggravated assaults. In that role, I probably investigated over 100 of those felonies.
All right, I want to move on and talk about today's case specifically. What did you find in today's case that led to your conclusions, Detective?
Well, I first became a part of this case back on August 25th of 2017. At that point in time, this was a missing persons case looking into the disappearance of Dawn Clark. After a year of investigation, we found evidence that actually implicated the defendant, his wife, Cara Bassett.
You said that you found evidence that would implicate his wife, Cara Bassett. What exactly was that evidence?
Well, there were three things in particular that stood out to the FBI. The first was the Clark family van.
Sorry, just a second. I think there's an objection.
Yes, Your Honor, I think that maybe you couldn't hear me. I believe I wasn't muted, but I had objected to lack of foundation on testifying that there were conclusions made evidence that pointed to Miss Bassett as the murderer in this case.
Okay, response?
Yes, Your Honor. This is the lead detective of today's case. He's the person who interviewed all of the witnesses. He was present during every step of the investigation. He's about to walk us through exactly what that evidence is and exactly why it pointed to Miss Bassett. The only foundation he needs to lay here is that he's the person who did the investigation.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Please.
And I'm not questioning Agent Johnson's qualifications, but for him to give a final conclusion on the case that we're all here to decide today, without first giving the foundation that we need to hear for the jury to evaluate that conclusion is improper. We have to hear what that evidence is first.
Response on that?
I'm going to overrule the objection, and since the testimony is out and he's now establishing the foundation that you think is lacking, but if at a later point you feel that sufficient foundation has not been laid for the conclusion, then I would urge you to re-object and move to strike the objection if you're successful at that point.
Yes, Your Honor.
Proceed, please.
Yes, Your Honor. Detective, you were talking about the pieces of evidence that you found. What were they?
So first, we took note of the Clark family van. It was actually a Chevy that was driven by both Don Clark and Kara Bassett. Second, we took note of a missing syringe that was filled with a deadly substance that was usually found at the Elephant Park, owned by Miss Bassett and Mr. Clark. And third, we took note of the defendant's behavior both before and after her husband's disappearance.
All right, Detective, I want to take those just one step at a time for the members of the jury. Starting first with the missing van. Exactly how did that factor into your investigation?
Well, like I said before, Kara Bassett and Don Clark owned a Chevy van. And we found evidence that on the day that Mr. Clark went missing, that van actually took a trip in the middle of the night, very far away from where the Bassetts lived.
Did you ever find out where that van went?
Yeah, so the van began in Tallahassee, Florida, at the Bassett's place of residence around 11 p.m. at night. The van was then driven 2 hours away to a swamp on the other side of the Florida Panhandle. The van then drove back towards the Bassett residence, and it was parked at 3 a.m. at an airport right next to the residence.
And is that airport where you found the van for your investigation?
Yes, it is.
Is there anything else about the van that stuck out to you?
So after we found that van, I called in our forensics team to do a full sweep of it to see if we can find any DNA, fingerprints, or organic material that would shed light on where Mr. Clark was. Upon that review of the van, we actually found organic matter, algae and mud that matched that swamp I mentioned a few moments ago.
And exactly how does finding algae and mud from the swamp factor into your evidence?
Well, it gave us a good idea about where exactly that van went on the night in question. Now that we found the algae and mud inside of the van, we knew for certain that it went to that swamp on the other side of the Panhandle on the night of August 18th. Additionally, we recovered boots from the defendant that had the same algae and mud on them that we found in the van.
Did you ever ask the defendant about how that algae may have appeared?
We did, and the defendant wasn't entirely truthful with us. She told us that she had never gone to that swamp, but we actually found organic material from that swamp on the boots that she owned.
Objection, Your Honor, speculation. May I explain?
Please.
Your Honor, this witness just testified that Miss Bassett wasn't truthful with him. Your Honor, we have a good faith basis to believe that that algae could have originated from a place other than the swamp that the witness just testified about. It's a step too far for him to definitively say Miss Bassett was lying.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. This is the lead investigator for today's case. This is a point of contention. He's simply saying, based on the evidence that he gathered, he finds it more likely that Miss Bassett wasn't being truthful by her whereabouts. They tested this algae at the lab, and it only confirms to come from one place. This is the same algae found on her work boots.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, the witness didn't testify that it was more likely she lied. He testified definitively the defendant wasn't truthful when he asked her this question. That's a step too far. We have no problem with him saying what she said, what he asked, but saying that she was actually lying, well, that's a step too far, Your Honor. That's speculation.
I agree. I'm going to sustain the objection and strike that portion of the response from the record. Please proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, after finding the algae on the work boots, what other pieces of evidence did you gather?
So upon finding the algae, we then went to the Elephant Park to review any evidence. And we took note of a missing syringe that was usually found in the zoo's inventory.
What about a missing syringe would help you in this investigation?
So the Elephant Park obviously had an apparatus that dealt with the health of the elephants. And part of that apparatus had certain chemicals and drugs that were used when the elephants would get sick or they needed any specific medical attention. One drug they had was called carfentanil. Now, carfentanil is actually a very dangerous sedative. It's enough to knock out an elephant, but if it's used on a human being, it can actually kill them.
And so finding this missing syringe, how did that factor in with this being a deadly substance?
Well, we know that in August of 2017, there were supposed to be 24 syringes filled with carfentanil in the zoo's inventory. But when federal investigators went to the zoo and counted up those syringes, we actually only found 23. So there was one syringe that was unaccounted for right when Mr. Clark went missing.
You say that syringe was unaccounted for right before he went missing. Did you find any other times that syringes went missing at the park?
Actually, we didn't. At all other times, the syringes were logged in a book and meticulously dated whenever they were taken out. Carfentanil is actually a Schedule II substance. So the FBI and the DEA require that places like elephant parks and zoos take very meticulous notes as to when those substances are taken out. So it's very odd to see that it wasn't logged in their books.
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay?
Which portion?
Yes, Your Honor. Hearsay to the statements about the FBI, that the FBI required this and communicated that to the Clarks.
Response,
Your Honor? Yes, Your Honor. This is just a detective gathering the information for today's case and using it for his subsequent action. Not that exactly the FBI would need the Clarks to have this information and would need them to follow it. Simply that as a Schedule II drug, the detective noticed this wasn't taken note of and noted that it was missing for his investigation. It's not being used for the truth of the statement.
Response, Your Honor?
yes.
The truth of the statement is that the Clarks are required to keep track of the syringes. They need that fact to be true. If it's not true, then it's not suspicious that there was a syringe missing, like they're claiming is the murder weapon in today's case, Your Honor. They're absolutely using that statement for its truth value.
Response on those grounds, Your Honor?
Sure.
We're absolutely not saying that this was a requirement that they needed to follow and that's what's made it suspicious. What's suspicious is that there is a meticulous log and suddenly one is missing. So it doesn't matter whether the FBI required it, only that the detective noticed that for his investigation and used that to come to his conclusions for today. It doesn't matter what the FBI says is required of the Clarks at their park, only that they usually take note of it and that this one situation where someone ended up dead, there wasn't a note of the missing syringe.
Okay, I'm going to sustain the objection based on hearsay and strike the portion of the answer in which he was quoting statements from the FBI. If he has an independent understanding of the FBI's policies, then I would encourage you to ask him for his independent understanding instead of any hearsay statements that were made.
Yes, Your Honor. May we proceed?
Please.
Detective, based on your understanding and training, what are you supposed to do with these types of substances?
Like I said before, carfentanil is actually a Schedule II drug. And through my experience with the FBI and my training in narcotics, I know that places that use carfentanil, so places like zoos or animal hospitals, they have to log their uses of carfentanil in a log that's then sent to agents later on during investigations like this. Like I said before, the zoo had actually logged every use of carfentanil previously, but that one syringe that was unaccounted for, they didn't log its usage.
All right, and Detective, I want to talk about the last piece of evidence that you mentioned. You talked about Kara's behavior leading up to and after the investigation began. Can you explain more about what you meant by that?
Of course. So a few months before Mr. Clark went missing, Miss Bassett actually had him sign a power of attorney form that stood out to investigators.
Exactly what stood out about it?
Well, essentially, this power of attorney form outlined two things. That in the event of Mr. Clark's disappearance, or in the event of his death, Kara Bassett would take control of his assets and also take control of the elephant park.
Detective, in any of the numerous cases you've investigated involving murders, kidnapping, etc., has there ever been a disappearance clause that leads to someone inheriting another person's assets?
Usually not. Usually power of attorney forms only deal with an individual's death. So in the event of death, a certain individual would receive that person's assets. This was actually the first power of attorney form that I saw have a disappearance clause. That in the event of someone's disappearance, their wife or spouse would receive their assets as well.
Now, you say that this disappearance form wasn't usual for these types of cases. Did Miss Bassett ever exercise that right of power of attorney?
She actually did. A couple months after she reported her husband missing, she exercised that power of attorney, took control of his assets, and took control of the elephant park that they previously jointly owned.
All right, I want to also move on to when Mr. Clark was actually declared missing. Who declared him missing?
So the defendant actually declared her own husband missing, but what stood out to investigators was the timeline of her contacting of law enforcement.
Why did that stand out to you all?
Well, Mr. Clark went missing on August 18th of 2017. And his own wife, the defendant, didn't report him missing until 6 days later on the 25th.
Did she say why she waited so long?
She was unable to provide us with a clear answer. She told us that she was waiting to hear from her husband and it wasn't too peculiar that he was gone, but she wasn't able to provide us a clear answer for why she waited that 6-day period.
Is it usual for someone to wait 6 days to declare somebody missing?
Normally not. Like I said before, I've investigated over 100 kidnappings, aggravated assaults, and homicides. And in most cases, we receive a missing persons report within 24 to 72 hours after an individual's disappearance.
Detective, did the status of Don Clark as missing ever change throughout the course of your investigation?
It did. About a year later, in 2018, in the month of August, Miss Bassett actually had her husband declared dead.
And exactly when would she have legally been able to do so?
She would only legally be able to do so exactly 1 year after he disappeared, and that's exactly what she did.
Thank you. I have no further questions for the detective.
Cross?
Yes, Your Honor. Hi, Agent Johnson. I'm going to be asking you some questions today. Can you see and hear me okay? I
can.
Perfect. So, Agent, I want to start by talking about the evidence you did and didn't find in this case.
Of course.
Starting with the body. Now, you just told us that you believe Mr. Clark's body was taken to a swamp. Is that right?
That's correct. That's what the evidence indicated.
Well, sir, you actually searched that swamp, didn't you?
Well, not just myself. We actually had a team of FBI investigators search that swamp, but our results did not uncover the body.
Oh, sir, that's right. You had an entire team of investigators help you search through that entire swamp. Is that right?
That's correct.
You were helped by trained police dogs?
That's right.
Like you just told us, you didn't find Mr. Clark's body in the swamp, right?
That's right. Our search was negative. We couldn't find Mr. Clark's body. We believe that either he was too far submerged down in the swamp or one of the animals that was home to that swamp ate the body or dismembered it in some sort of way.
Well, Agent, just to be clear, I'm not asking you to guess about what happened. I'm just asking you about what you found. And to be clear, you never found Mr. Clark's body in the swamp. Is that right?
That's correct.
You also searched the elephant park where Mr. Clark lived and worked, right?
That's right.
You didn't find his body there, right?
That is correct.
Sir, because you never found Mr. Clark's body, you were never able to get an autopsy. Is that right?
Well, that's correct. Because we never found the body, a medical examiner was never able to review it. That's right.
That's right. So, sir, you can't tell us what exact time Mr. Clark died. Is that right?
That's correct. But we do have a pretty general window for when Mr. Clark was murdered on the night of August 18th.
Again, sir, I'm not asking you to guess. I'm asking if you know specifically. And the truth is you don't. Isn't that right?
Well, we know that Mr. Clark was murdered sometime between 11 and 11:18 p.m. on August 18th, sometime before 11:18 p.m. on that day.
Well, sir, you also don't know how Mr. Clark died. Isn't that right?
Well, I would have to disagree with you, counselor. We believe that Miss Bassett used that carfentanil, that syringe, that elephant sedative to kill her husband.
Sir, I want to be clear about the difference between what you found and what you didn't find. Well,
Sure.
What you found was there was a missing vial of carfentanil. Is that right?
That's right. There was an unaccounted syringe at the zoo.
What you didn't find is carfentanil in Mr. Clark's blood, right?
Well, ma'am, that would be impossible. We never found the body, but we were able to piece together what we believe happened on the night of August 18th.
So, sir, that's a no to my question. You didn't find carfentanil in Mr. Clark's body, right?
That's correct. We never found Mr. Clark's body.
Now, I want to ask you about some evidence you just mentioned on direct examination. You told us that there was algae from a swamp and on a van and on Miss Bassett's boots. Is that right?
That's correct. We found organic material from the Big Gum Swamp on the other side of the Florida Panhandle, on the pedals of the van, and on Miss Bassett's own boots.
And you realized that you found that those were a match because your forensics team compared the algae on each of those samples. Is that right?
That's correct.
Sir, I want to take a closer look at what your forensic team actually found. Mr. Castleberry, could you put Exhibit 5, the forensic report, on the screen for us? Sir, I want to focus in on the section related to algae. Will you follow along with me as I read this aloud?
Sure.
We did not test or collect any samples from Big Gum Swamp against any natural substances, dirt, watering holes, at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park or other Florida swamps. Sir, the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, that's where Mr. Clark and Miss Bassett live and work, right?
That's correct. But during our review of the park, we found no areas that had algae, so we didn't find it necessary to take any samples and compare it to the boots or the van.
Sir, it's your testimony there's no mud at an elephant park?
No, I said, ma'am, there's no algae. There is mud, but when we found the boots and we found the van, we saw that there was algae. Because we found no algae at the elephant park, we didn't find it necessary to take samples from there.
Sir, I want to be clear. You didn't take those samples to see whether or not there was algae. Isn't that right?
Well, ma'am, we did a full sweep of the elephant park back in Tallahassee. We found no evidence that there was any algae at the elephant park, so we didn't find it necessary to take any mud samples from there either.
Sir, the answer for my question is no. You never took mud samples from the elephant park, right?
That's correct. We never took any samples from the elephant park. It wasn't consistent with our findings on the van or Miss Bassett's boots.
You never compared any samples from the elephant park to any other samples in this case. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, sir, I want to ask you about who else might have been involved in this case. Now, you're familiar with Mr. Clark's attorney in this case. Is that right?
That's correct. I am.
He wrote you a letter concerning Mr. Clark's legal matters involved in this case.
That's right.
Mr. Castleberry, could we put that on the screen? It's Exhibit 4. Now, sir, this is that letter, isn't it?
I believe so, yes.
I want to focus in on a section where the attorney wrote you about properties Mr. Clark had in Costa Rica. Now, Mr. Clark's attorney, he told you that Mr. Clark was looking to purchase properties in Costa Rica, right?
That's correct.
He told you that he wanted to buy those properties using cash that was off the books?
Well, that's what his attorney said right here, yes.
Sir, you know that Mr. Clark was actually in contact with other people from Costa Rica on the day that he went missing. Isn't that right?
That's correct. We found evidence that Mr. Clark actually called an individual from Costa Rica on the day that he went missing.
That's right, Agent. You reviewed his phone records.
That's correct.
These are those records?
I believe so, yes.
Now, you know that Mr. Clark received 2 text messages that day from an unlisted Costa Rican phone number, right?
That's correct.
Those messages were in Spanish.
That's right.
But they translate to call me immediately.
My Spanish isn't great, but I'll take your word for it. Yes, that's what it says.
Sir, that's what you wrote in your report, that the text message translate to call me immediately.
That's exactly right.
Sir, you know that after he received those text messages, Mr. Clark placed a phone call to that same phone number.
That's right.
That phone call lasted 52 minutes.
That's correct.
Agent, I want to keep track of this information.
Objection, Your Honors, to relevance. May I be heard?
Go ahead.
In order to talk about any phone calls at length that Don Clark would have had with anybody potentially from Costa Rica on the day of, they have to then connect that with this case somehow. Just because Don had talked to somebody on the phone days, hours, even minutes before, does not implicate them automatically in today's case. So far in this questioning, there's been no connection as to how this would have made it so that Ms. Bassett had not married Don Clark. It's irrelevant.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Please.
First off, the defense doesn't have a burden in today's case. It's not our job to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that anyone else committed this crime. However, what the victim, Mr. Clark, did in the hours before he went missing is certainly relevant to today's case, as it's our theory that one of these people could have been involved, but we don't know for certain because the government never investigated.
Overruled. Continue.
If Mr. Castleberry, we could put that timeline on the screen that I had just mentioned. Thank you, sir. Now, Agent, those text messages you just told us about, those came in at 6 p.m. on August 18th. Is that right?
That is correct.
That phone call we just talked about lasted from 6 p.m. to 6:52 p.m. on August 18th.
That's right.
Sir, that's just hours before Mr. Don went missing. Is that right?
Well, it's not exactly right. We believe that Mr. Clark went missing around between 11 and 12 on August 18th. He was last seen with his wife at 9 p.m. So those phone calls were actually quite some time before we believe that he went missing.
Agent, 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., that's 3 hours before, right?
Well, at 6 p.m. he received those text messages and had that phone call. At 9 p.m. that was the last time that Miss Bassett actually confirmed that she was with her husband. And we believe that he was murdered between 11 and 12 on the 18th.
Okay, Agent, in that case, 6 p.m. to 11 p.m., that's 5 hours before. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, sir, the phone number listed that made that phone call and text message, it's on the screen, isn't it?
That's right.
Sir, you don't know who that phone number belongs to?
We were unable to locate the person who had that phone number. That's right.
Never spoken with the person who that phone number belongs to?
That's correct. We were unable to locate that individual.
But to this day, you don't know who that person is or why they were speaking with Mr. Clark. Isn't that right?
Well, we were able to gather what they could have been speaking about. We believe they were having a conversation about that attorney's letter you mentioned a few moments ago, about Mr. Clark actually moving some assets to Costa Rica. But we were never able to speak to that individual. That's correct.
Agent, I'm not asking you to guess. Like you just told us, you have no idea who that person is, right?
That's correct.
Thank you, sir. Your Honor, I have nothing further at this time.
Anything further from the prosecution?
Yes, Your Honor, a redirect.
Go ahead.
Detective, you were just asked about Costa Rica connections with Don Clark. Did you ever find that Mr. Clark actually went to Costa Rica during that weekend at all?
So after Mr. Clark went missing, we contacted Interpol and they put us in contact with the Costa Rican Police Department. They looked over the entire island. They looked at the places that Mr. Clark would frequent when he went there, and there was no sign of him in Costa Rica whatsoever.
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay?
To which portion?
Yes, Your Honor. To the statements by the Costa Rican police that they searched for Mr. Clark and didn't find him.
Okay, response?
Your Honor, we're using this for the subsequent action of the detective. As she just mentioned on cross-examination, she talked about the detective not looking into these phone numbers and not knowing who these people from Costa Rica are. This is him saying that using the information that I gathered, I subsequently decided that there was no need to look into Costa Rica as the evidence never indicated that Mr. Clark ever arrived there.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Sure.
We're not here today to decide whether or not Agent Johnson had a full or complete correct investigation. We're here to decide whether or not Ms. Bassett is guilty of killing her own husband. The prosecution is absolutely using these facts for the truth of the matter asserted, that Mr. Clark never made it to Costa Rica. That's the truth of the matter, Your Honor.
Okay, I will overrule the objection and provide a limiting instruction to the jury at this point that that information that he shared from Costa Rica or from the Costa Rica police was not for the truth of the matter asserted.
Yes, Your Honor. May we proceed?
Please.
Detective, was there any other evidence that indicated that she needed to look further into his ownings or assets in Costa Rica?
There was nothing of note. We spoke to Mr. Clark's attorney. We had that letter that she gave us. Then we contacted the Costa Rican Police Department. There was no sign Mr. Clark arrived there on August 18th, and there was no sign he went there on any subsequent day.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Recross?
No recross, Your Honor.
Okay. Anything further from the prosecution?
Nothing further, Your Honor. May the detective step down?
Please. Defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Before we call our witness, I just wanted to let Your Honor know we do intend on using that same timeline we just had up in this direct examination, but we've gone ahead and redacted the testimony from Agent Johnson so that there's no issues with witness sequestration, and we'll reveal the whole thing in closing arguments.
That's good.
Your Honor, with that, we call Mr. Joe Kwong to the stand.
Okay, whenever you're ready.
Hi, Mr. Kwong. I'm going to ask you some questions. Can you see and hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear and see you great. Are you good with me?
Sounds perfect.
Awesome.
So, sir, could you go ahead and introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Sure. Hi, my name is Joseph Kwong, but you can just call me Joe.
Well, what do you do for a living, sir?
Well, right now, I'm a producer. Mainly, I work on documentaries and things like that.
How did you get into that line of work, a producer?
Well, my parents were actors when I was growing up, but I was never really, as comfortable in front of the camera as they were. So I, went to school to become a producer. Right out of school, I got a job as an intern at a movie studio. I worked my way up to a writer, and then I became a producer of my own.
Mr. Kwong, are you familiar with Kara Bassett?
I am. Yeah, Miss Bassett had hired me to film a documentary about her elephant park a few years ago.
Was Miss Bassett paying you for that work, creating a documentary?
She was. I charged a fee of $5,000 a month for my work, as well as a 20% stake in whatever profits the documentary made.
Sir, where were you filming this documentary?
It was actually at the elephant park that Miss Bassett and her husband owned. Our documentary was called The Elephant Queen. It's kind of like Tiger King, but with elephants instead of tigers.
Well, sir, did you become familiar with Mr. Clark and Miss Bassett while you were working on this project?
Absolutely. I was at that park 5 days a week for about 3 years, so I was very familiar.
All right, sir, I want to start by talking about a specific piece of evidence we heard about today, an elephant tranquilizer. Have you ever seen an elephant tranquilizer at the elephant park that the Clarks owned?
I have. Yeah, they had elephant tranquilizers there, in case they needed to use one on the elephants.
Do you know who used those?
Well, I had seen some people use them before, specifically the doctors, some staff, and Miss Bassett.
Do you know where those tranquilizers were actually kept on the property?
I do. Yeah, they were in a locked shed on the property that you needed a key to get into.
Well, did you see how many people had keys to that shed?
So far as I could see, maybe a dozen.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I want to turn your attention to Mr. Clark specifically. Now, this may seem like a strange question, but do you know if Mr. Clark owned a plane?
I do actually, yeah. Mr. Clark owned his own private plane. It was Cessna.
And did you ever go in that plane yourself?
Yeah, Mr. Clark had taken me up in it a few times before.
Where was that plane kept or stored?
Whenever I was up in it, it was at the airport that's just about 5 minutes away from the Clark house.
Sir, do you know if Mr. Clark owned any sorts of properties outside of the United States?
I do. Yeah, I know Mr. Clark owned a vacation house down in Costa Rica, actually.
How do you know that?
Well, I've actually been there before.
Why did you go there?
Well, the last time I was there was June of 2018. I actually went there looking to see if I could find Mr. Clark.
And sir, was that part of your work in this documentary?
It was. Yeah, we were filming an episode on his disappearance to add to the doc. So I was going down there to see what I could find.
And now, sir, I want to go ahead and turn your attention to the day that Mr. Clark went missing, August 18th.
Okay.
We'll start by talking about Miss Bassett. Were you with her at all on that day, August 18th?
I was with Kara for most of that day.
Well, did you notice if she was acting nervous?
Nervous? No, I didn't see that.
Was she acting upset at all?
Not that I saw.
Agent, did you notice any conversations between Miss Bassett and her husband, Mr. Clark?
Well, I did hear Kara talking on the phone once about Costa Rica.
What did you hear Miss Bassett say?
What I heard her say was, "Sweetheart, you can go without me."
Objection, Your Honor, is to hearsay.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. We're not offering this statement for the truth of the matter asserted. We don't know whether or not Mr. Clark actually did go to Costa Rica. We're offering this statement to show that Miss Bassett was on notice that her husband was planning to go to Costa Rica to rebut the prosecution's evidence that she should have immediately called the police the day after she realized he was missing.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes.
That necessarily means that they're using it for the truth of the matter in the statement, that Don Clark was going to Costa Rica and that his wife was okay with that. The only way that this statement would be useful for today's case is for the truth of the matter. There's no other action it could show.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
Again, Your Honor, the truth of this statement, whether or not Mr. Clark actually went to Costa Rica, is not why we're using that. We don't know whether or not that's true. We're using this statement because Miss Bassett believed it to be true after hearing it. That's why she didn't immediately call the police. We're using it for that purpose, Your Honor, which is not actually the truth in the statement.
May I respond on that, Your Honor?
Sure.
Well, then you would be getting into speculation. This witness would not be able to say that Miss Bassett believes something simply because she said something to someone on the phone. This statement would be used for the truth of the matter asserted to show the jury that Don Clark indeed was planning to go to Costa Rica, as they've already tried to prove during cross-examination.
Overruled. Continue.
So, Mr. Kong, you were just telling us what Miss Bassett actually said on the phone call. Could you repeat yourself?
Sure. She said, "Sweetheart, you can go without me."
Did you ever see Miss Bassett yell at her husband on that day?
On that day, no, I didn't.
Did you see her fight with her husband on that day?
I didn't see any fights between the two that day.
So how was Miss Bassett acting on August 18th?
I mean, so far as I could see, she was acting like she always had when I was there.
Sir, I want to ask you about Mr. Clark on that same day, August 18th.
Sure.
Did you see him at all that day?
I did. I saw Mr. Clark later in the day.
What time was that?
Probably around 6 p.m.
And now, sir, I know this was a few years back, but do you remember whether or not Mr. Clark had his phone with him?
I actually do. Yeah. When I was with him, at some point he got a text on his phone and he looked down at it. And then as soon as he looked at it, his face turned sheet white. And then right away he said, "I have to deal with this." And he left the room.
Sir, I want to go ahead and add that to our timeline. And Mr. Castleberry, could you put that on the screen for us? Thank you, sir. Mr. Kwong, after Mr. Clark said, "I have to deal with this," and left, did you ever see him again?
No, that was the last time I saw him.
Well, did you ever have any contact, see or hear from him ever again?
I didn't know, but Kara actually showed me a text that Don had sent her later on that evening.
Do you remember what that text message from Mr. Clark to Miss Bassett said?
Yeah, it said, "Going out for a while."
Sir, what time was that text message sent?
11:14 p.m.
Sir, after that text message, did you ever hear or see or have any contact with Mr. Clark ever again?
No. I never spoke or saw to Don ever again.
Sir, thank you for your time today. Your Honor, nothing further at this time.
Cross,
Yes, Your Honor, may I proceed?
please.
Mr. Kwong, I want to start with something that you mentioned on your direct examination. You talked about Kara's behavior on the day Don disappeared, right?
Yes, I did.
You said she didn't fight with him, correct?
Yes, that's right.
She didn't threaten him or anything, correct?
Yes, right. Not that I saw.
Well, something you also told the jury just now is that that's usually how Kara behaves, isn't it?
Right. More often than not, that's how Kara was behaving.
Right, more often than not, but you do know that Kara and Don had fought several times in your presence, hadn't they?
Yeah, I had seen them fight a few times before.
You know exactly what they fought about too, don't you, Mr. Kwong?
Most of the fights I saw were about whether it would remain an elephant sanctuary or whether it would remain an elephant park or turn to an elephant sanctuary.
Right, you know that Don said it needed to be a business and that Kara said it needed to be a sanctuary, correct?
That was what most of the arguments I saw were about.
They didn't just end as arguments, though. They continued to be fights sometimes, didn't they?
They did escalate once or twice, yes.
One time, you saw Kara get so angry that she threw a glass vase at her husband's head, didn't she?
Objection, Your Honor. Under Rule 404, this is improper character evidence.
Response, Your Honor?
Can you explain how this is improper character evidence first?
Yes, Your Honor. They're using this specific action of Miss Bassett throwing a vase at her husband's head to suggest that she had a propensity to get aggressive with her husband, which of course is what they're alleging happened in this case. That's the improper character evidence, Your Honor, as they're using it for propensity reasoning.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. This actually goes to 404B2, a permitted use of character evidence. We're not trying to show that Miss Bassett would have acted in propensity or conformity with that. We're saying here that she had the motive, intent, and plan in order to carry out this action. She's having constant fights with her husband about turning the zoo into a sanctuary. She finally kills him and then turns it into a sanctuary. It's us showing a clear pattern of motive here.
Do you have a response to that?
Yes, Your Honor. If they're using this to establish a pattern, it is in fact propensity reasoning. There's no way that the prosecution is going to be able to tie this specific action that happened in the past to Miss Bassett's murder in this case. Your Honor, as you know, there's no eyewitnesses who are going to be able to testify that they actually saw Miss Bassett act aggressively towards her husband on the day of question. So they're using this prior act for propensity reasons. It's character evidence, Your Honor.
Overruled. Please continue.
Yes, Your Honor. And so you saw Kara throw a glass vase at her husband's head once over the park, didn't she?
I did, yeah.
Something else that you noticed was different on the day that Kara's husband, Don, disappeared. Kara usually complained about Don leaving her, didn't she?
Right. Whenever Don would go to Costa Rica, Kara typically wasn't happy about that.
Right. Typically, she would complain that Don was abandoning her, correct?
Yes.
She would beg him to tell her why she couldn't go along, correct?
From what I saw, yes.
But on the day Don disappeared, Kara didn't have any problems with going to Costa Rica, right?
None that I knew about.
She all of a sudden didn't have any issues with the elephant zoo not being a sanctuary, correct?
Well, I heard them talking about Costa Rica specifically, but she was generally calmer that day.
Right. She was generally calmer the day her husband happened to disappear, right?
It was that day, sir. I can't tell you whether anything's related.
Okay, Mr. Kwan, I want to move on and talk about someone that you may know at the park. You
Okay.
know about a person named Hugh Bassett, don't you?
I do, yes.
Well, Mr. Bassett, you know he appeared at the park a few times in early 2017, right?
Yes, that's right.
You know that Don didn't like Mr. Bassett very much, did he?
Objection, Your Honor, speculation.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor, if you give me a bit of leeway, I'm about to lay the foundation as to why he would assume that Don believed that about Hugh.
Why don't you go ahead and rephrase your question?
Yes, Your Honor.
Sustain the objection.
Now, Mr. Kwong, you actually saw Don accuse Mr. Bassett of flirting with his wife, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And to which
Hearsay and relevance.
What's the hearsay statement?
Yes, Your Honor, I don't know the exact statement, but the hearsay was about Mr. Clark accusing this person, Hugh Bassett, of flirting with his wife.
response, Your Honor?
Yes.
There is no exact statement because we're not soliciting one. We're talking about a number of instances that happen. Over time, we know that Mr. Kwong observed the victim, Mr. Clark in this case, accusing Mr. Bassett of flirting with his wife. We're also not using that for the truth of the matter that he in fact was flirting with Ms. Kara Bassett, only that Ms. Bassett heard that statement and responded with the quote that I'm about to elicit next.
Okay, I will overrule the hearsay objection. What's your response on speculation?
Your Honor, excuse me, it was a relevance objection.
Oh, I'm sorry. Relevance. Can you explain? Why don't you go ahead and explain your relevance objection?
Of course, Your Honor. Your Honor, we haven't heard any reason why conversations that Ms. Bassett or Mr. Clark had with this other person, Hugh Bassett, would be relevant to today's case. There's just no bearing how these conversations could have had an effect on whether or not Ms. Bassett killed her own husband. No one in this case is accusing Ms. Bassett of infidelity. The agent didn't testify, but wrote in his report that he found no evidence of that. This testimony just isn't relevant.
Do you have a response?
Yes, Your Honor. We're actually about to link all of this together for you in just a few questions. We're going to show that there is a clear connection between the timeline of Hugh Bassett's arrival at the park and interactions with Ms. Bassett and her subsequent husband's disappearance. It's very suspicious, the actions of Hugh Bassett leading up, and the jury needs to hear that.
Okay, I'm going to overrule the objection, but feel free to reassert the objection if this doesn't get tied up.
Understood,
Yes, Your Honor.
Proceed.
May I proceed? Now, Mr. Kwong, you noticed that Hugh Bassett was accused of flirting with Kara Bassett, the defendant, multiple times by the victim, Don Clark, correct?
I did, yes.
And you know that Kara always responded that Hugh was only there to help with accounting, right?
That's right. That's what Kara said.
But in 2018, January of 2018, Kara and Hugh started a relationship, didn't they?
They did, yes.
In fact, Mr. Kwong, you know that Kara and Hugh got married the day that Don was declared deceased, don't you?
That's right, I do.
Your Honor, again, I would raise my objection to relevance. The fact that Ms. Bassett decided to remarry after losing her husband does not make it more or less likely that she murdered her husband in this case.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. Based on the timeline that I've laid here, it's very clear that this is relevant to the case. You have a person who is appearing at the park early 2017, the year of the murder, who is accused of constantly flirting with the defendant and is told that they don't have any interactions at the park. Suddenly, a year later, once the defendant's husband is dead, they remarry them and work at the park with the defendant directly under them. This is something that's important for the jury to point out and shows possible motive for the defendant, Kara Bassett, today.
May I respond?
Sure.
Again, Your Honor, the fact that Ms. Bassett decided to remarry does not make it more likely that she killed the husband that she was married to in 2017. Your Honor, this evidence just isn't relevant to that claim, and to suppose otherwise is frankly wrong.
Final response, Your Honor?
I'm going to overrule the objection. Please continue.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. And so you know that, Mr. Kwong, you know that the defendant, Kara Bassett, married her new husband the day that Don was declared dead, correct?
Yes, that's right.
You know that Hugh Bassett, her new husband, also owned an accounting firm, right?
That's right.
And he quit that accounting firm to come and work for Kara, didn't he?
Yes, that did happen.
A difference between Hugh and Don that you noticed while interviewing and doing your research at the park is that Don didn't like the animals the way that Hugh did, correct?
That's how it seemed to me, of course.
Right, it seemed to you that Hugh loved the animals the same way that Kara did, didn't he?
Yes, it did.
In your 2,000 hours of filming, you never found any evidence that Hugh and Kara fought about the elephants, did you?
That's right.
Kara never threw any vases at Hugh's head over elephants, did she?
Not that I know.
Kara never threatened Hugh in the slightest, did she?
Again, I never saw anything like that.
Right. In your opinion, Kara liked her new relationship a lot more because she was finally in charge, right?
That's certainly how it seemed to me looking from the outside.
Objection, Your Honor, speculation.
Response?
I'm asking directly for this witness's perception. He says that he interviewed and recorded all of the interactions at the park for over 2,000 hours. I'm asking him, based on his perception and what he recorded, did you ever find any indication of how Kara felt about a relationship? And as he testified, to him, it seemed that way.
Okay, overruled. Please continue.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Kwong, I want to talk to you exactly about your work that you were doing at the park.
Okay.
You started working there in 2015, right?
Yes, that was when I was hired.
You were hired by Kara Bassett, correct?
I was.
You weren't hired by Don Clark, correct?
That's right. Miss Bassett hired me.
Miss Bassett was the one who paid you, wasn't she?
Yes.
Now, Miss Bassett paid you every single month that you interviewed and did recordings at the park, correct?
That's correct. That's the fee I was charging.
Right. You charged a fee of $5,000 a month to record videos at the park, didn't you?
That's right.
And Kara faithfully paid that $5,000 all the way until September of 2018, didn't she?
That's right. That's just about a 3-year period. And that month of September was when she was arrested.
Right. So you earned over $100,000 from Kara Bassett before she was arrested, right?
Yes, that's right.
And when she was arrested, your payments stopped, didn't they?
The monthly payments, yes.
Thank you. Your Honor, I have no further questions. Actually, Your Honor, I have one more thing I'd like to enter into evidence before this witness is let down off the stand.
Okay.
Now, Mr. Kwong, you did a number of interviews of Kara Bassett at the park where you just recorded videos of her, correct?
That's right. Those were interviews for the documentary to see what we could incorporate.
All right, and would you recognize those interviews if I showed them to you today?
I would, yes.
Ms. Piriano, could you pull up Exhibit 38, video from Kara Bassett?
People look at me and they think I'm sweet and nice.
Evidence at this point?
Response, Your Honor?
Do you have an objection to the video?
Yes, Your Honor. Our objection is to Rule 403 that this is substantially more prejudicial than it is probative. May I explain?
Please.
Your Honor, we know that this video was filmed as part of this reality TV, a documentary series that Mr. Kwong was filming. We don't have any context to know if Miss Bassett was being truthful in this video, whether she was being untruthful, or whether she had reason to dramatize the events as part of the reality TV that she was filming. And it's simply more prejudicial than it is probative to offer this in a court of law.
Response, Your Honor?
Please.
As we've already proven throughout today, Ms. Bassett was very, very angry with her husband's decision to not turn the zoo into a sanctuary. She threw a vase at his head that almost hit him. This is a video 2 months prior to his disappearance in which Ms. Bassett says she's willing to take anybody who opposes her to the grave. It's very relevant and important for the members of the jury to hear these type of threats being made. There's no indication from Mr. Kwong or anybody for that matter that she would have lied or been untruthful in this case.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Sure.
Again, we're not objecting to relevance or to any of that previous evidence that Mr. Madden just mentioned, but to this video specifically, that we don't know the context about, whether or not this reality TV interview was actually real. As we know, a lot of reality TV isn't real. We don't know whether or not she was being dramatic for the purposes of the camera. And because of that, the jury can't appropriately assess the probative value of this video, and it's highly prejudicial, Your Honor.
Response on that?
Sure.
Your Honor, this is a matter of weight, not admissibility. Seeing as Ms. Bassett is not able to take the stand and be cross-examined for today, it's up to the jury as the fact finders to look at this interview and decide whether or not it's credible for them. It's very important for the jury to hear that the potential defendant and murderer in today's case threatened to kill anybody who got in her way just months before her husband disappeared.
Overruled. Please proceed.
Yes, Your
You
Honor.
can continue playing, Ms. Piriano.
People look at me and they think I'm sweet and nice. Go on. Keep underestimating me. I will lobby senators. I will protest big businesses. I will get in your face. I will take people to their grave if I have to. I will do anything to protect these elephants.
Sir, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Do you recognize this video, Mr. Kwong?
I do. That was one of the videos I filmed.
It's a fair and accurate copy of that video.
It looked like it to me.
The prosecution enters Exhibit 38 into evidence.
Any objection?
Nothing other than the 403 objection that we dealt with, Your Honor.
Admitted.
And with that, we have no further questions for this witness.
Anything further from the defense?
Nothing further from the defense, Your Honor. We rest our case in chief and are ready to proceed to closing argument.
Okay. We will now hear the closing arguments from each party. Everyone should please switch back to speaker view. Also, since both witnesses have completed their testimony, you can complete the witness portion of your ballot. Closing argument for the state.
Yes, Your Honor. May we proceed?
Go ahead.
Ms. Piriano, if you could pull that video back up. And just play it from about the halfway mark.
Lobby senators. I will protest big businesses. I will get in your face. I will take people to their grave if I have to. I will do anything to protect these elephants.
Thank you, Ms. Piriano. Members of the jury, that's all you needed to hear for today, because that perfectly summarizes what today's case is about. It's about passion. It's about poison. You saw and heard numerous times throughout today's case just how passionate Ms. Bassett was about these elephants. She loved them, she supported them, and she just wanted them to be free. And while we may disagree with how Don decided to treat the animals, and that this was only a business, however, we're not here for Don, because unfortunately, Don didn't get to go to court the way we are today. Don didn't get to have a representative. Don didn't get to argue his side, because Kara, his wife, decided to take the matters into her own hands, decided to take Don's life into her own hands and get what she wanted. She told you right there, she'll lobby senators, she'll lobby big business, she'll take you to the grave if she has to. She'll do whatever she needs to do in order to make that sanctuary happen. And members of the jury, she did just that. When that clause in that power of attorney form became a thing, saying that all Don had to do was disappear. If he disappeared, then Kara would get access to all of his assets, all of his funds, access to controlling the park. The moment Don went missing, she did just that. She redid the park. She turned it into the sanctuary she always wanted, and now it's exactly her vision. Not only that, you heard exactly who Hugh Bassett was, how this suspicious person was frequenting the park early on, how the day Don went missing, he was there, how as soon as Don is declared dead, he marries his wife. Members of the jury, the line of evidence given to you by the investigator makes it abundantly clear just how Kara did it and why she did it. The investigator, Steve Johnson, told you that it started with that power of attorney form. That was a red flag, but it doesn't stop there. If you look at the GPS from the van, it drove 140 miles away from their residence to a random swamp, back all the way to an airport only 5 miles away, and left there. You may be asking yourself, exactly why is that significant? Well, one, members of the jury, it's highly unusual for you to take an hours long trip out of your way just to come right back. Not only that, there was evidence, biological evidence, that the defendant just couldn't get rid of. You see, the detectives found algae that only originates from Big Gum Swamp in the van, on her boots, and on her wheelchairs. Members of the jury, that's evidence for you right there that Miss Bassett wasn't being truthful when she said she'd never heard of that swamp. There's no records of algae at all anywhere on that zoo ground. There's no record of algae at all anywhere where she lives. As the lab told you, that algae came from Big Gum Swamp. The same algae on her boots, the same algae on her wheelchair, the same algae found in that van. Now that van was left at the airport. The same airport that Don flew out of to go to Costa Rica from time to time. As you learn, he had a vacation home there. And while the defense may try to blurry the lines and muddy the waters to show you that maybe he did go to Costa Rica, we don't know. But what evidence did we hear about that today? We heard that Don usually flies on his own, but his plane was still in the hangar. You heard that they talked to the Costa Rican officials, the police, how they found no evidence that Don ever arrived, how they found no evidence that he ever lived there. Mr. Kwong even said he went to Don's house in Costa Rica and he was unable to give you any indication that he was actually there. There's no reason to doubt the story that the prosecution is telling you because it's what happened. You heard about Miss Bassett's behavior the day of, about how it totally contradicted her attitudes before. All of a sudden, she had no reason to fight with her husband about it becoming a sanctuary. All of a sudden, she had no reason to throw glass vases at his head. All of a sudden, she was totally fine with being abandoned for him to go to Costa Rica on his own. Members of the jury, that's not a coincidence. That's a plan. That's a motive. And as Ms. Bassett told you in that video you saw during the end of that cross-examination, people don't give her credit for how smart, how self-aware, whatever it takes to get exactly what she wants. The detective also told you about that missing syringe. How in the years of owning this animal zoo and when it was converted to a sanctuary, there has never been a single syringe unaccounted for. But again, the defense wants you to believe that it's just a coincidence that the same month her husband goes missing, a syringe does as well. Members of the jury, the evidence is there for you. And it was solidified for you the moment that Kara Bassett decided she was going to declare her husband deceased when she could. And she took everything that she needed from him. You heard today that she had millions and millions and millions of reasons to do what she did. That's because she inherited those millions and millions and millions of dollars. She made her own dream come true, as she told you, at any means possible. We've proven our case to you beyond a reasonable doubt. We've shown you how she did it. We've shown you why she did it. And that proves to you that she murdered her husband and that she did so intentionally. We've met the two prongs of our burden far beyond a reasonable doubt, members of the jury. And that's why we're asking for the only reasonable decision of today's case. Find the defendant, Kara Bassett, guilty of murder. Thank you.
Defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Unanswered questions. Mr. Madden just came and spoke before you, and he told you that what happened to James Clark is a tragedy. And members of the jury, we agree. I agree. What happened to Mr. Clark is a tragedy. His family does deserve closure. like this? Because what we saw in this case was a story with too many unanswered questions. And a case with unanswered questions, it doesn't give you closure. It doesn't give you justice. It just leaves you with doubt. And that's important, members of the jury, because remember, it was the government's job to prove to you that Miss Bassett killed Mr. Clark, her husband, beyond any reasonable doubt. They just weren't able to meet that burden today because their case left too many questions unanswered. I want to take you back through each one of those questions I asked you to keep in mind at the beginning of today's trial. First off, where is the body? Remember, it's their theory that Mr. Clark's body ended up in the big gum swamp, but you've heard today, the FBI agents investigating never found that body. Because they were never able to perform an autopsy, we don't know when Mr. Clark died. We don't know how Mr. Clark died. We don't know where Mr. Clark died. Members of the jury, for all you know, he could have died before he got into that van, after he got into that van. He could have been killed here in Florida, in Costa Rica, somewhere else altogether. He could have been injected with a tranquilizer or shot in the forehead. The fact is, we just don't know. Second, what does their evidence actually prove? Members of the jury, when Mr. Madden came up here at the beginning of today's trial, he made you a promise they were going to prove their case beyond any reasonable doubt. Miss Bassett murdered her own husband. And when he made that promise, I wonder what you thought you'd see in court today. A single eyewitness to confirm their story. Any forensic or DNA evidence proving that Miss Bassett even left her home that night. A body, anything to support their story at all. Instead, what the government brought you was some mud in a van and on some boots. Members of the jury, I want to take a closer look at what their own forensic team actually found. Remember, Agent Johnson came up here and tried to explain it away. He told you, well, they didn't check the mud at the elephant park because there wasn't any algae there. But members of the jury, look at this forensic report. The algae that they used to say Miss Bassett had to have been at the swamp. She had to have killed her husband. Members of the jury, it's microscopic algae. An FBI agent looking at mud wouldn't be able to determine whether or not that matched the samples at the swamp or in the van or on her boots. So if you look a little closer at the evidence, what does it actually tell you? They found mud on someone's boots. Well, that proves Miss Bassett worked at a zoo. They found mud in a van. That proves she drove that van for work. They told you about this power of attorney document. Members of the jury, that proves that a husband left his money to a wife. If the evidence they showed you can prove something else, something that's not Miss Bassett killing her husband, then they haven't proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. So finally, I want to bring you to that last question I asked. Who else could have done this? You heard today about what Mr. Clark did on the day he disappeared. Remember that at 6 p.m., just hours before he went missing, he got a text from an unidentified Costa Rican phone number. That text message said, "Call me immediately," and you heard as Mr. Kwong described how he reacted to that message. The color drained out of his face. He seemed terrified. He said, "I have to deal with this," and he left. And he took a 52-minute phone call with that very same phone number. Members of the jury, the government wasn't able to tell you who was on the other end of that phone. Don't you think it's possible that whoever that was wanted Mr. Clark to disappear? See, members of the jury, maybe that phone call was totally innocuous, but maybe not. Maybe Mr. Clark really was injected by an elephant tranquilizer, but maybe not. Maybe that algae they told you about really only exists in one swamp of all of Florida, but maybe not. And the truth is, maybe or maybe not just isn't proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So instead, they brought you this video of Miss Bassett, claiming that because she's complaining about her husband, she's dramatic in this video, well, that means she had to have killed him. Members of the jury, remember what that video is. It's footage for a reality television show. The fact that she complained about her husband on camera, sounded dramatic, made big claims, that doesn't make her a murderer. That makes her a dramatic participant in a reality television show. Members of the jury, in a minute, Mr. Madden is going to come back up here, and he's going to ask you to forget about those questions we wanted you to keep in mind. He wants you to forget the questions they didn't ask, the questions they don't have answers to. That's not your job, members of the jury. It's your job to keep those questions in mind. It's your job to demand answers to those questions. It's your job to make sure they do their job. And they didn't. Find Miss Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor, may I proceed?
Go ahead.
Now, members of the jury, I actually do want you to think about those questions that Ms. Mehta just asked you. She asked you 3 questions. Where's the body? What does the evidence actually prove? And who else could have done this? Well, if you were looking throughout today's case, we gave you evidence of exactly how to answer each of these questions. Where's the body? The detective told you that the swamp it was inhabited in could have submerged too deep or have just been dismembered by the animals that lived there. 2, what does our evidence actually prove? It proves that 1, Miss Bassett was violent toward her husband. If you throw a glass vase hard enough to shatter at somebody's head, it could potentially kill them. But the defense wants you to believe that because she said something in a reality TV video, that's not true. That's not real. Well, even if you don't want to believe that video, believe Miss Bassett's actions when she threatened her husband with violence for the very reason that she killed him, for the very reason that she decided to run the sanctuary, because she loves the elephants. It's a case about passion and poison, and we've answered those questions. Find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Judges, you should go ahead and complete your ballot and click submit. I'll ask everyone to stay on until everyone has submitted their ballots, and then we'll do some brief comments.